6 children vanished without a trace on what was supposed to be an ordinary day. No clues, no witnesses, just a mystery that would haunt the town for decades. This is their story. Stay with me until the end, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the truth behind the world's most chilling disappearances. The night the children vanished from St. Aurelia's hostel began without warning, without a whisper of the storm that would soon tear through every soul who had ever crossed its threshold. It was one of those evenings where the air felt strangely heavy, as if the world itself was holding its breath. The lamps in the corridor buzzed faintly, their pale yellow glow stretching shadows long and thin across the polished wooden floors. Outside, the wind sighed in slow, deliberate gusts, brushing against the tall iron gates that enclosed the hostel grounds. Inside, everything seemed ordinary, painfully ordinary, the kind of calm that later feels almost sinister when remembered. The matron was making her usual evening rounds, checking that the windows were latched and the hallways clear. The other staff had already retired to their rooms or offices, their doors shut against the chill that seeped through the old stone walls. 6 children slept in the East Wing that night. They weren't all from the same backgrounds or ages, but they shared the same dormitory, the same beds neatly lined in 2 rows, the same thin blankets tucked tight around them by the same caring but overworked hands. Their names would soon become headlines, whispered in every household, prayed for in churches, and etched in the nightmares of those who loved them. But for now, they were just children, laughing hours earlier over a bedtime story, whispering secrets under the covers, trading biscuits they had saved from supper. No one heard them leave. That was the first thing investigators would later find impossible to accept. There were no sounds of hurried footsteps, no creak of the ancient floorboards, no slam of the heavy doors. One moment they were in their beds, and the next they were gone, swallowed by the night. The first sign that something was wrong came at dawn. The sky was a pale bruise of colors, soft blues and purples bleeding into the horizon. The matron entered the East Wing dormitory, carrying her usual tray of warm milk and bread. She set the tray down, speaking softly to wake the children as she always did, her voice warm and practiced from years of care. But as her eyes swept the room, the words died in her throat. The beds were empty, not just unmade, empty cold, the pillows untouched as if they had never been slept in. 6 neatly folded sets of pajamas lay on the floor by the door, as though deliberately placed. Their blankets were pulled up to the pillows, smooth and undisturbed, except for a faint indentation on each mattress, a shadow of where small bodies had been hours before. She dropped the tray. The sound of shattering glass echoed through the dormitory, but even that felt distant, muted. She backed away from the beds, as if they might suddenly reveal their occupants. Her heart was pounding so hard she could hear in her ears. The hostel erupted into chaos within minutes. Staff scoured every floor, shouting names in the hallways, flinging open cupboards, even searching the laundry bins and storage rooms. The gardens were combed, the gates checked, the perimeter inspected for any breach. But the gates were locked from the inside, and the tall iron spikes would have been impossible for children that age to climb without leaving marks or signs. The police arrived before the sun had fully risen, their boots heavy on the stone steps, radios crackling with clipped voices. Questions were fired at everyone. When was the last time they were seen? Had anyone visited during the night? Were there any family disputes, any threats, any unusual noises? The matron kept repeating the same thing. They were here last night, they were fine, nothing happened, nothing seemed wrong. But the more she said it, the more her voice trembled, because deep down she had noticed something odd. It was small, barely a detail at the time, but it had been enough to lodge itself in the back of her mind. The night before, when she was making her rounds, she had seen a shadow move in the corridor outside the East Wing. She had assumed it was one of the older boys sneaking to the kitchen for a midnight snack. She had called out, but there had been no answer. When she looked, the corridor was empty. She had dismissed it until now. The parents were called, their voices breaking on the other end of the line, some collapsing into sobs, others demanding to speak to the children immediately, as if the staff could simply walk into another room and bring them back. By mid-morning, news vans had begun to gather outside the hostel gates, cameras pointed at the entrance, reporters shouting questions over each other. But the strangest thing was this. There was no sign of forced entry. No footprints in the garden soil, no broken locks, no tampered windows. Even the dormitory door had been locked from the inside when the matron arrived that morning. It was as though the 6 children had simply ceased to exist. The days that followed blurred into a haze of interviews, searches, and hushed conversations behind closed doors. The hostel became a place of tension, each creak of the old building sending jolts of fear through those who remained. The other children were moved to different wings, kept under constant supervision. Yet they too whispered stories of hearing faint knocking sounds in the night, of seeing faces at the windows that vanished when looked at directly, of feeling their blankets pulled away while they slept. No one wanted to believe them. But then came the first clue. On the 4th night after the disappearance, one of the gardeners found something buried at the base of the old elm tree near the east wing. It was a small wooden box, no bigger than a shoebox, wrapped in a strip of cloth so faded it was almost colorless. Inside were 6 silver coins, each engraved with a symbol no one recognized. The coins were cold, unnaturally cold, as though they had been sitting in ice, though the ground around the elm was dry. The police took the box as evidence, but the matron couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't meant for them. It felt like a message, one they didn't understand yet. And then came the letters. 3 days after the coins were found, an envelope arrived at the hostel addressed simply to the ones who keep watch. Inside was a single sheet of paper. The handwriting was precise, almost elegant, but the words chilled everyone who read them. They're where they were meant to be. Do not seek them in the places you know. The path they took cannot be retraced by those who walk on earth. The police dismissed it as a cruel prank, but the matron knew. She didn't know how she knew, but she felt it in her bones. This was not a kidnapping in any ordinary sense. Something else had taken them, something beyond her understanding. The nights grew longer after that. Staff began leaving their posts early, refusing to patrol the east wing after dark. The children spoke less, their laughter gone, replaced by the sound of restless shifting in beds and the occasional muffled sob. And all the while, in the silence between midnight and dawn, faint footsteps could be heard in the east wing. Footsteps that stopped the moment anyone entered. The investigation reached a dead end. Weeks passed. The parents stopped visiting daily, their hope eroding into a dull, desperate grief. The news vans moved on to fresher stories. But inside St. Aurelia's, the air still felt wrong, heavy, charged with something unspoken. One evening, long after the police had given up active searches, the matron stood in the east wing alone. She looked at the 6 empty beds, at the neatly folded pajamas still sitting where they had been found that morning, untouched since. A storm rattled the windows, and for a moment she thought she heard laughter, childish, high-pitched, and distant, as if carried on the wind from far away. Her knees nearly gave way. She gripped the bedpost to steady herself, her heart pounding in her ears. The sound faded as quickly as it had come, leaving only the rain against the glass. She didn't know then that this was only the beginning, because in the weeks to come, others would vanish. And when they did, the truth about St. Aurelia's would begin to claw its way to the surface. The second disappearance was not supposed to happen. The staff had sworn it couldn't. Every possible precaution had been taken after the first tragedy. Doors were reinforced with new locks, windows nailed shut, gates watched by hired guards through the night. Every child was accounted for hourly, each movement noted in a strict log. Parents were assured, somewhat dishonestly, that their children were in the safest place imaginable. And yet, the rules of the ordinary world no longer seemed to apply inside St. Aurelia's hostel. It happened exactly 29 nights after the first 6 children were taken. The air that day had been unusually still, the kind of oppressive calm that presses down on the chest like a weight. By evening, a fog had begun to roll in from the river, seeping into the streets, softening the edges of the lamplight until the hostel seemed to float in a muted, dreamlike haze. In the West Wing, 3 siblings, Eleanor, Samuel, and little Jane, were sleeping in the same dormitory. They were inseparable, their closeness a comfort to the staff, who hoped it might keep them from feeling the fear that still gripped the building. The matron herself checked on them 3 times that evening. She found them tucked in, Jane clutching a worn teddy bear to her chest, Samuel's hand resting protectively on her blanket. At precisely midnight, the night guard began his patrol of the West Wing corridor. He would later insist he heard nothing unusual, no footsteps, no doors opening, no voices. When he returned 20 minutes later, the dormitory door was still locked from the inside. Yet when it was opened at dawn, the beds were empty. All that remained were 3 objects, placed side by side on the windowsill. A strip of blue ribbon, a marble with a spiral of green glass running through it, and a tiny silver bell that did not ring when shaken. The hostel descended into chaos once again. Staff screamed at each other in the hallways, demanding explanations no one could give. The parents arrived within the hour, their cries tearing through the air like knives. The police returned, grim-faced, their earlier skepticism replaced with something heavier, something close to dread. The discovery of the objects on the windowsill brought back memories of the first clue, the wooden box of coins under the elm tree. The matron felt certain they were connected. These were not random tokens. They were personal, each one belonging to the child it represented. She remembered seeing that blue ribbon tied in Eleanor's hair on her first day at the hostel. Samuel had been endlessly proud of his marble, showing it to anyone who would listen. And Jane's bell had hung from her teddy bear's neck until it disappeared days earlier. The police dismissed it again. "We're dealing with a very clever individual," one officer said, his voice tight. "Someone who likes to play games." But no one could explain how that individual was moving unseen through locked doors, past armed guards, without leaving the faintest trace. It was then that the matron made a decision she would not tell anyone about. Not the police, not the staff, not even her closest friend in the hostel. She would start keeping watch herself. For the next week, she hardly slept. She wandered the corridors in the small hours, a candle in one hand, her other hand pressed to the wall as if feeling for a pulse. The hostel at night was a different place entirely, its shadows deeper, its silence heavier, broken only by the distant ticking of the old grandfather clock in the main hall. And sometimes she heard it. Not footsteps this time, but a sound she could never fully describe, a low, rhythmic hum, like a lullaby hummed by someone far away, the notes bending and warping in ways that made the hairs rise on her neck. It came from no fixed place, moving through the building as though carried on a wind that didn't exist. One night, she followed it. She crept along the corridor, her candlelight quivering against the walls. The sound led her toward the East Wing, the one that had been closed off since the first disappearance. The doors were padlocked, the key kept in the warden's office. Yet as she approached, she saw the doors were standing slightly ajar. Her breath caught in her throat. The inside of the wing was colder than the rest of the hostel, as if the air itself had been drawn away. The beds where the first 6 children had slept were still made, still untouched, but the air smelled faintly of damp earth, like a cellar left too long unvisited. She moved forward, the hum now louder, though she still could not place its source. It stopped abruptly when she reached the far wall. She stood there, candle raised, scanning the smooth plaster for any sign of movement. That was when she saw it, a faint outline, a shape barely visible in the flickering light. It was the size of a small door, but set low into the wall, almost at floor level. She knelt and touched it. The plaster felt wrong, soft like damp paper. She pressed harder, and her fingers went through. Inside was darkness, so deep it felt solid. She could smell earth and something else, something metallic and sharp. She leaned closer, and for a fraction of a second, she thought she saw movement within, a flicker of pale shapes, like the outlines of small hands reaching toward her. She stumbled back, her candle nearly going out. By the time she caught her breath and looked again, the wall was smooth plaster once more, No sign of the hole or the shapes within. The next morning, she said nothing. She told herself it was exhaustion, that her mind was inventing horrors in the absence of answers. But deep down, she knew she had seen something real. And then, just as the fear was beginning to harden into a grim routine, the third disappearance came. This time it was not in the middle of the night. It happened in broad daylight during morning lessons. The children were in the study hall, the tutors standing at the front of the room. One of the teachers turned to write on the chalkboard, and when she turned back, 2 seats were empty. The children who sat in them were gone. No one had seen them leave. No one had seen the door open. It was as if they had been erased from the room while 30 witnesses sat watching. On the desk where they had been working lay 2 items, a torn page from a storybook and a small brass key with no teeth. The hostel was now a place of whispered panic. Staff avoided meeting each other's eyes. Parents began pulling their children out in the middle of the night, some not even stopping to collect belongings. The warden's face grew drawn and pale, his voice trembling when he addressed the remaining families. Through it all, the matron kept searching. She began to notice other things. The way the fog from the river seemed thicker around the hostel than anywhere else. The way certain rooms felt colder even when fires were lit. The faint smell of soil and rainwater that sometimes lingered in the air after a disappearance. One evening, in the half-light of dusk, she found something else. Behind the old bookshelf in the warden's office, tucked into a gap in the wall, was a bundle of papers tied with twine. They were letters, old, their ink faded, some with water stains that blurred the writing. The earliest was dated 1874. They were written by a previous matron, a woman named Clara Vey, and they told a story that mirrored what was happening now. Children had vanished from the hostel before, 12 of them, in a span of 3 months. The disappearances had stopped as suddenly as they began, with no trace of the missing ever found. One letter, dated in the final days before the last disappearance, ended with a single line that made the matron's blood run cold. "It is the house. It remembers what it was promised." She didn't sleep that night. She sat in her office, reading the letters over and over until dawn, her mind racing through possibilities too strange to speak aloud. And in the stillness before sunrise, she thought she heard that sound again. The low hum, moving through the walls like breath. Only this time, beneath it, she heard something else. A child's voice, whispering her name. By the time autumn settled over the town, St. Aurelia's hostel had become a hollowed shell of its former self. The laughter of children no longer echoed through its halls. Doors that had once stood open were now kept locked at all hours. Those who still worked there moved like ghosts, speaking in hushed voices, their eyes darting to shadows as though expecting them to shift. Only a dozen children remained. Their parents had either nowhere else to send them or clung stubbornly to the belief that the hostel was still safe. They were wrong. The matron had stopped pretending otherwise. She had read and reread every letter from Clara Vey until the words were etched into her thoughts. The stories from 1874 were too precise, too similar to be coincidence. The same strange tokens left behind. The same inexplicable vanishing from locked rooms. The same silence from the walls afterward, as if the building itself was swallowing secrets whole. And now the voices. They came more often, almost nightly. Sometimes she woke to the faint sound of a child's laughter in the corridor outside her door. Other times, she heard her own name breathed so close to her ear that she turned expecting to see someone standing there. But the worst were the whispers she couldn't quite make out. Half words, fragments of sentences, urgent and desperate, slipping away the moment she tried to focus on them. She began writing everything down in a small leather-bound notebook. The time the noises began, where they seemed to come from, what objects, if any, appeared after each disappearance. Her notes formed patterns. The objects always held deep personal value to the children. They always appeared in places of visibility, a windowsill, a desk, the floor at the foot of the bed. And there was always that smell. Damp earth, as if something had been unearthed nearby. The fog from the river returned in early October, thicker than before. On some nights it swallowed the hostel completely, turning the world outside the windows into a blank, gray void. The guards reported hearing strange sounds in a mist, bells tolling in the distance, footsteps pacing along the outer walls, whispers calling from the garden, though no one was there. The matron knew something was coming. She didn't have to wait long. It happened on the night of the first frost. The remaining children had been put to bed early, the fires stoked high to keep the chill from creeping into their bones. The matron was making her final rounds when she heard it again, that hum, low and steady, vibrating faintly through the floorboards. But this time it wasn't alone. Beneath it came a rhythmic tapping, like knuckles rapping on wood. It was coming from the east wing. She gripped her candle and followed the sound down the corridor. The padlocked doors stood before her, but when she reached out, the lock fell open in her hand, the metal strangely warm. She pushed the doors inward, their hinges groaning in protest. The smell hit her first. Earth, yes, but fresher this time, almost wet. She stepped inside, the tapping louder now, and her candlelight caught movement along the far wall. It was there again, the low door she had seen before. This time, there was no plaster over it. It stood slightly open, a faint light flickering inside. Her pulse quickened. She took a step forward, then another, until she could see through the gap. Beyond the doorway was a tunnel, narrow and lined with wood so old it looked as though it might crumble at a touch. The floor was packed dirt, damp beneath her shoes. And far ahead, just at the edge of the light, she saw them, small figures, motionless, facing away from her. Her breath caught. They were children. She whispered their names, but none of them turned. They stood as still as statues, their heads slightly bowed, their arms hanging at their sides. She moved forward, her candle trembling in her grip. That was when the air changed. It grew heavier, pressing against her chest, and the hum grew louder until it was all she could hear. The figures began to move, not toward her, but deeper into the tunnel, their steps slow and synchronized. She called again, louder this time, but her voice seemed to vanish into the air before it reached them. Panic surged through her. She lunged forward, but the moment her foot crossed the threshold, the candle went out. Darkness swallowed her. She froze, listening. The hum was still there, but now was joined by a new sound, a deep, slow breathing, as though the tunnel itself had lungs. The figures were gone. She knew it without needing to see. The next thing she felt was a sudden, cold pressure at her back, pushing her forward. She stumbled into the dark, hands outstretched, and found only empty air. She turned to retreat, but the doorway had vanished. Her fingers met solid earth where it had been. She stood there for what felt like hours, until the breathing stopped and the hum faded into silence. Then, without warning, she was in the east wing again, her candle still unlit, the low door sealed behind her. By morning, 2 more children were gone. Their beds were empty, their belongings untouched. On one pillow lay a small, clay figurine shaped like a bird. On the other, a single autumn leaf, its edges perfectly intact, as though it had never fallen from a tree. The matron stopped trying to convince herself this was the work of a person. Whatever was taking the children was older than the hostel itself. She thought of Clara Vey's last letter. It is the house. It remembers what it was promised, and began to wonder if the building had been built here for a reason. She needed answers, and she needed them quickly. In the town archives, she found the original plans for St. Aurelius. The hostel had been constructed over the ruins of an estate belonging to a man named Elias Brandt. Brandt was a reclusive figure in the late 1700s, known for his fascination with preservation of youth, though no one seemed to know exactly what that meant. When his estate burned in 1791, he was never found, though some swore they saw him walking the riverbank for years afterward. One scrap of a newspaper article caught her eye. It was dated months before the fire and mentioned Brandt hosting gatherings for the local children, where they were given silver coins as tokens of his favor. No one could explain where those coins came from. The matron's blood ran cold. She thought of the first clue, the 6 coins under the elm tree. That night, she returned to the east wing with a lantern, determined to find the low door again. She pressed her hands against the wall, searching for the soft give she had felt before. Hours passed, but the wall remained solid. She was about to give up when she heard it. Not the hum this time, but a voice, clear, sharp, right at her ear. Tonight. She spun around, but the corridor was empty. The voice had been that of a child, but not any child she recognized. When she returned to her room, she found an envelope waiting on her desk. Inside was a single line written in that same precise, elegant hand as the first letter. The last will come for the first. She didn't sleep. She sat by the window, watching the fog creep over the garden, her lantern burning low beside her. She thought of the remaining children and wondered how many more nights she had before they were taken. In the stillness before dawn, she made a decision. She would not wait for the next disappearance. She would go into the tunnel, if it appeared again, and she would not come back without the children. She didn't know it then, but the night she made that promise was the last night the hostel would ever be the same. Because by the end of the week, St. Aurelia's would hold no children at all. The final week at St. Aurelia's hostel began like the slow tightening of a noose. Each day seemed heavier than the last, the air inside the building thick with something unseen but felt in every breath. The remaining children clung to one another in uneasy silence. The guards no longer spoke during their patrols. Even the warden, who had once barked orders with authority, now moved like a man afraid of being overheard by something that should not be listening. The matron barely left the East Wing. She prowled its corridors like a restless shadow, listening for that hum, for the whispers, for anything that might signal the appearance of the low door again. She slept in short, fitful bursts, never allowing herself to drift too far from waking. On the third night of that week, it came. It was near midnight when the hum began. So faint at first she thought it might be her imagination. But it grew quickly, vibrating through the walls, the floor, the very air. And then came the tapping, soft, deliberate, beckoning. She followed it to the far end of the East Wing, her lantern throwing long, quivering shadows across the floor. And there it was, the low door, unsealed, its edges glowing faintly in the darkness, as though light from another place bled through. Her pulse hammered in her ears. She took the lantern in one hand, braced herself, and stepped through. The tunnel was exactly as she remembered. Narrow, lined with rotting timber, the smell of damp earth curling into her nostrils. But this time, the air was warmer, heavy with a strange sweetness, almost like overripe fruit. She moved forward, her footsteps muffled by the packed dirt. The hum surrounded her now, so loud she could feel it in her ribs. And then she saw them, the children, all of them, the first 6, the 3 siblings, the 2 from the classroom, the others who had vanished since. They stood in 2 lines along the walls of the tunnel, motionless, their eyes closed. Their faces were pale, almost translucent, and their chests rose and fell so slowly she had to watch for several moments to be sure they were breathing. She called to them by name. No response. She moved closer, reaching for the nearest child, and froze. Their skin was cold, colder than stone. And beneath her touch, it seemed to yield slightly, as if softened somehow. She pulled her hand back, heart pounding. A voice spoke from deeper within the tunnel. You came. It was not the voice of a child. It was low, almost melodic, each word wrapped in an unplaceable accent. She lifted the lantern, but the light seemed to falter, its reach shrinking until the figure ahead was barely visible. A man stepped forward, or it was something shaped like a man. His clothes were from another time, a long coat buttoned high at the neck, his hair pulled back from a face too smooth for his apparent age. His eyes gleamed in the lantern light, sharp and knowing. You have kept them well, he said softly, as they were kept before you, and before the one before you. She found her voice, though it shook. Who are you? He tilted his head, as though the question were strange. This place was mine, long before it was given another name. These halls remember, the walls remember, and the promise. He let the words trail off, smiling faintly. The promise remembers. What promise? She demanded. He moved closer, and she could see now that his eyes were not any color she recognized, just a deep, shifting darkness that seemed to draw the light in. A fair exchange, he said. Their youth for my years. A simple thing. They are not harmed. They are preserved, as they have always been. You might even say they are cherished. Her stomach turned. You take them. I keep them, he corrected. The world outside wastes them. Here, they remain. You call it taking. I call it keeping safe what the world would otherwise destroy. She glanced at the children, at their still faces, their slow, shallow breathing. You can't keep them. They belong to their families. They belong, he said, to the promise. She stepped between him and the nearest child. Then you'll have to go.